Dusk on the Ross ice shelf comes not as darkness, but as a draining of colour, a slow bleed of blue out of the world until the snow and the sky become the same substance, and it was into that colourless hour, on the 9th or 10th of March in 1934, that 8 men stopped their sledges and looked at the horizon and saw that something on it was looking back. It stood perhaps 400 yards off, on ground they had already surveyed and knew to be flat, and the first thing wrong about it was its height. Nothing stood on that plain. There were no ridges there, no seracs, no pressure ice, nothing to break the line of the shelf for miles in any direction, and yet this shape rose up off the flat like a figure cut from the whiteness and stood taller than any man among them, taller than the sledge masts, a pale vertical wrongness against a paler sky. It was white, not the grey white of weathered ice, not the yellowed white of old snow, but a clean, sourceless white, the white of something that gives off no shadow of its own. And it was smooth. That was the detail the survivor came back to, again and again, in the months they kept him under observation, that the thing had no joints, no knees, no elbows, no seam at the shoulder where a limb should meet a body. It was jointless, he said, the way a candle is jointless, the way a length of bone is jointless, a single continuous form tapering upward to something that might have been a head and might only have been the place where the shape ended, and it had too many limbs. He would never say a number. That is one of the small, terrible gaps in the record, and we will come back to it. But he was certain, to the end, that when he counted the limbs against the sky, he counted wrong, that there were more of them than a man is built to have, arranged in a way a man is not built to be arranged, and that some of them hung down and some of them did not, and that they did not move the way arms move. He said it stood there in the failing light, with those limbs held out from its body, motionless, patient, as if it had been standing there long before they arrived, and would go on standing there long after. They watched it. 8 men on the ice, roped in a line, breath freezing on their beards, and not one of them spoke, because as they watched, it began to move, not to walk, to mirror. When Peterson, second on the lead sledge, lowered his arm, the shape lowered a limb. When the men shifted their weight, it shifted. When they leaned to see it better, it leaned. Slowly, out of time by a heartbeat, like a reflection cast on water that has not quite settled, it gave back to them their own gestures, and the horror of that, the survivor said, was not that it copied them, but that it copied them badly, a fraction too slow and a fraction too far, the movements of something learning how a body is supposed to work by watching theirs. Then it took a step toward them, and they turned the sledges and ran. I have spent a long time inside the few pages that survive of what happened over the following 4 nights, and I will lay all of it out for you, the diary, the entries that grow shorter and stranger, the names of the men who did not come back. But before any of that, I want you to hold on to the single physical fact that undoes every comfortable explanation. The fact that the one man who walked off that ice alive repeated in the same flat, frostbitten voice no matter how many times they pressed him, no matter what they threatened. It left no tracks. They fled across fresh snow, soft enough that their own sledge runners cut 6 inches deep and their boots punched holes at every stride, and each morning when the light returned, they looked back along the line of their flight and saw 2 things. They saw their own trail, ragged and desperate, stretching to the horizon, and they saw the shape, closer than it had been the night before, closer by a mile, by 2 miles, standing on that same unbroken snow with nothing beneath it. No prints, no drag, no disturbance of any kind in the surface. A 400-pound thing, tall as a mast, that crossed miles of soft snow in the dark and left the snow as smooth as a bedsheet behind it. Warm-bodied men leave a story on the ice. Every one of us does. Weight and heat and motion write themselves into snow whether we wish it or not. It is the oldest kind of record there is, and it cannot lie, and it cannot be bribed. The thing that followed them wrote nothing. It moved across the most honest surface on Earth, and the surface refused to admit it had been there. When they finally brought the survivor back to the coast, and I will tell you how and what it cost, he was missing 4 fingers and most of both feet to the frost, and he weighed less than 9 stone, and for 11 days he would not speak at all. When he did speak, he did not rave. That is what unsettled the men who wrote it down. He was calm, he was precise. He described the height, the smoothness, the wrong count of limbs, the way it mirrored them, the absence of tracks, all of it in the level tone of a man giving a survey report. And when they asked him the only question that mattered, "What was it, man? What did you see?" he said the one sentence that would follow him into the asylum and out the far side of his life, the sentence that appears, underlined, in the single medical page that escaped the purge. It walked upright, he said, but it wasn't a man. He would not go further. Not that night, not in the years after, not to the doctors, not to the naval officers, not to the one journalist who found him decades later in a home on the Scottish coast and was turned away at the door. He described everything it did. He described exactly how it looked. But he would never, not once, put a name to the thing itself, as though naming it were the last door he refused to open, the one act that might call it back down off the ice and across the water it had stopped at. To understand why he stopped at that door, you have to understand who those 8 men were, why they were out on the Ross ice shelf in the autumn of 1934, and what their own field diary recorded in the 4 days before the whiteout took them one by one. They were not adventurers. That is the first thing to fix in your mind. The 8 men who walked south from the depot at the edge of the Ross ice shelf in the last week of February 1934 were a working survey party. Surveyors, a geologist, a magnetician, 2 experienced sledge hands, a medical officer, and a young naval sub-lieutenant seconded to keep the instrument logs. They were the kind of men who measured things for a living. They carried theodolites and aneroid barometers and a mercury artificial horizon packed in felt. Their whole purpose was to fix positions, to record, to reduce the unknown to numbers on a page. Whatever else you believe about what happened to them, hold on to that, because it changes the weight of every line they wrote. These were not men given to seeing figures in the snow. They were trained, specifically and professionally, to distrust their own eyes and to write down only what the instruments confirmed. The expedition was a small offshoot of a larger effort, one of those minor sledging traverses that the heroic age spun off by the dozen and that history has almost entirely forgotten. Their task was a magnetic and topographic survey of a corridor of the shelf running roughly southeast from the coast, a flat white nothing the size of a small country, ice 500 feet thick, floating on a sea no man had ever seen. They expected 6 weeks. They provisioned for 10. The sledges went out fully loaded, the dogs strong, the men fit and, by every account that survives, in good spirits. The last entry made in an ordinary hand, the neat, careful, almost bored hand of men doing routine work, is dated the 2nd of March. Position fixed, temperature logged, wind from the south-southeast, force 3. Nothing, a day like any other on the ice. The next day, the 3rd of March, the diary changes. Not the handwriting, that stays steady for a while yet, but the content. Between the barometric readings and the ration notes, someone has written a single line that has no business in a survey log, figure on the horizon bearing roughly south, stationary, and then, as if the writer felt the need to explain himself to whoever might read it, 4 more words, too tall for a man. I have spent a long time with that line. I have held the photostat of it under a lamp and read it until the words stopped meaning anything, and then read it again until they came back. Because the thing that arrests me is not the strangeness of it, it is the restraint. A frightened man writes exclamation marks. A liar writes a story. This man wrote a bearing. He treated the figure exactly the way he would have treated a nunatak or a distant pressure ridge, as an object to be logged, positioned, and watched. And watch it they did. For the next 4 nights, that figure appears in the diary at the close of every day's marching, and each time the entry is a little longer, and each time the bearing has changed, and each time the distance has closed. That is the detail that turns the stomach of anyone who reads the original. It closed the distance. On the 3rd of March, it stood on the very rim of the world, a black vertical mark against the low sun, so far off that 2 of the men argued it was a shadow thrown by an ice hummock and nothing more. On the 4th, it was nearer. On the 5th, nearer still, and the geologist, a careful man, a fellow of a learned society whose name I will give you in the final part because of what was done to his reputation, noted with a surveyor's precision that its estimated bearing and range implied it had covered some 11 miles in the night. And yet, he wrote, no one saw it move. That is the phrase, underlined once. No one saw it move. Think about what that means on that ground. The Ross ice shelf at that latitude in autumn is not a place where anything hides. It is the flattest, emptiest, most pitilessly open surface a human being can stand upon. A plain of white running unbroken to a horizon that curves away clean as a drawn line. A man on that ice can see another man at a distance of miles. There is nowhere to duck, nothing to step behind, no fold in the land to swallow a moving shape. If a thing crosses 11 miles of it, you see it cross. You see it the whole way. Unless it only moves when you are not looking. Unless it stands, and stands, and stands, motionless as a surveyor's stake through all the hours you watch it. And then, in the one interval you close your eyes, in the dark of the tent, in the whiteout, it is simply closer, and no snow between you and it holds the mark of a single step. They set watches. Of course they did. They were disciplined men and they were afraid, whatever the level tone of the diary pretends. From the 4th of March, the log records a night watch, one man awake by the primus while the others slept, eyes on the southern bearing, and the watch entries are the worst of all because they are the calmest. Figure holds position, one reads, at what the man judged 1.5 miles. An hour later, the same watch, the same hand. Figure nearer, cannot say by how much, did not see it approach. He was awake. He was watching. He was looking directly at the thing, and it came closer while he looked, and he could not catch the motion. It was patient the way weather is patient. It was patient the way the cold itself is patient, and it wanted, the diary makes plain without ever daring to say so, one specific thing. It wanted them. Because here is the pattern that emerges from those 4 days, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. The figure was drawn to the camp at night, to the heat of the primus, to the breath of 8 sleeping men fogging the tent walls. It closed the distance only in the dark, only toward warmth, only toward the small living furnace of a human body burning food against 40 degrees of frost. In daylight, marching, it held its range or fell behind. At night, when they stopped and lit the stove and their bodies gave off the one thing that place had none of, heat, breath, life, it came, slowly, silently, without a track, toward the fire and the lungs and the beating that ran under their frozen skins. And on the 6th of March the whiteout came down. You must understand what a whiteout is to grasp what happened next. It is not fog. It is worse than fog. It is a condition of the light in which the overcast sky and the snow-covered ground reflect one another until every shadow is erased and the world becomes a single featureless glow. No horizon, no up, no down, no distance, a blindness made of pure brightness in which a man cannot see his own feet or tell whether he is standing or falling. It swallowed the party on the 6th of March, and in the diary, in a hand that has finally begun to shake, someone wrote the last coherent survey line the expedition would ever produce. Visibility nil. Figure lost to view. Roped together for safety. Roped together. 8 men on a single sledge line in a white blindness, unable to see one end of the rope from the other, and something out there in the glow that came toward warmth and breath, and had already crossed 100 miles of ice without leaving a mark. They could not see it. But it, I think, did not need to see. It had 4 nights of practice at moving through the dark, unwatched. And now the daylight itself had gone blind, and the 8 of them were tied in a line, warm and breathing, in a whiteness with no horizon left to keep a bearing on. That is when they began, one by one, to go. The way the diary records it is the part that undoes me, because it is not written as a massacre. There is no scream on the page, no struggle, no crossed-out horror. There is only the quiet arithmetic of a rope going short. The entries after the whiteout descended are not survey lines anymore. They are counts. They are men counting each other in the dark, and finding, each time they count, that there is one fewer to count. Understand the mechanics of what they had done to survive. When you rope a party together in a whiteout, you do it so that no man wanders off the line and is lost in the glow within 20 paces of his companions and never found. Each man has his place on the rope. Each man can feel, through the tension in the line, the pull of the man ahead and the drag of the man behind. It is a nervous system made of hemp. A tug means a living body still attached. Slack means nothing. Slack means only that the man behind has stepped closer. And that, the survivor said, over and over, in the fragments of testimony that were allowed to be transcribed before they stopped him. That was how it took them. Not with a sound, with slack. The man at the rear went first. His name, from the crew manifest, was Corporal Edwin Rourke, 29 years old, a signalsman from Portsmouth. The line behind the 7th man simply went loose. No cry, no jerk, no sudden weight thrown against the rope that 8 men could have hauled against together. Just a length of hemp that had been carrying the tension of a living body and now carried nothing, trailing off into the white, its far end lighter than it should have been. They pulled it in. The survivor said they pulled it in with their frozen hands, and at the end of it, the loop that had been tied around Rourke's chest was still tied, still knotted, still closed, and empty. Not cut, not broken, not frayed. Untied is not the word either. Opened. As though something had reached into the blindness behind them and lifted a grown man out of a closed loop of rope the way you would lift a ring off a finger, and left the ring behind. And this is the detail the skeptics have never been able to walk past, the detail I keep returning to at 2 in the morning. His gear was untouched. Rourke's pack still clipped to the sledge. His ice axe still lashed. His mittens, later, because they found the mittens, they found them lying on the snow in the shape of 2 open hands, thumbs out, as if he had been drawn upward and backward out of them, without so much as clenching. It took the man. It left everything the man was carrying. It wanted nothing that did not breathe. They did not run. You cannot run in a whiteout. To run is to die of your own accord, off the edge of a pressure ridge, or into a crevasse the glow has painted over. So they did the only thing men can do. They pulled the line tight, closed the gap, shortened the rope, and pressed forward toward the coast with 1 fewer than before, and they kept counting. And on the next stop, the count came up short again. The 2nd man from the rear this time, same silence, same slack, same knot, opened and empty, the loop lying on the snow still perfectly round. I have read a great many accounts of men dying on the ice, starvation, cold, the slow surrender of Scott's party writing letters as the drift piled against the tent. Those are terrible, but they are legible. They have a shape a human heart can hold. This has no shape. This is men marching in a blindness, roped for safety, feeling the rope go light behind them 1 body at a time, and knowing, this is the thing, they knew, that whatever was doing it was working its way up the line toward the front. Toward them, in order, patiently, from the back. The way you might eat, saving the best for last, or the way something without hurry moves when it has already understood that none of them can see and none of them can flee, and there is nowhere on that entire shelf for warmth to hide from a thing that hunts warmth. The survivor was near the front. He was the second man on the rope, behind the expedition's leader, and he described the final night. Though we do not know if it was truly night, the whiteout had stolen even that as a thing he heard through the hemp more than saw. The rope behind him going slack and slack and slack again, each interval shorter than the last as the line grew shorter and the taking grew closer, until there were only two of them left, himself and the man ahead, and then the man ahead, his commander, roped 4 feet in front of him, close enough to touch in clear air, invisible in the glow. He said he felt the line to the front go light in his hands. He said he did not pull it in. He said he already knew what the loop would look like, and he could not bear to hold the emptiness of it, so he untied himself from the dead rope, and he walked. And here the story turns from horror into something stranger, because it stopped taking and started following. Alone now, the last warm thing on the ice, he did not vanish like the others. It let him walk. It came behind him. He could not see it, but he could feel it the way you feel a draft from an open door at your back. A cold that was somehow colder than the cold. And it kept its distance, and it herded him. That is the word he used. Herded, north, downhill. Toward the sound, when the whiteout finally thinned, of open water. Toward the coast, where the ice shelf ends in a cliff and a fracture line, and the black Ross Sea grinds against the barrier. He came out of the white onto the seaward edge with the thing close behind him, and he did the only thing left to a man with the ocean in front and death at his back. He went down the tide crack, down onto the shelf ice where it met the sea, down to the black line of water, and he turned around, and it was there, in the last of the failing light, on the ice, exactly as the men had logged it 4 days running. Tall, white, wrong-jointed, standing at the place where the solid ice ended, and it did not come further. It stood at the tide line, at the very margin where the frozen shelf gave way to salt water, and it stopped, as though the water were a wall, as though the tide line were the edge of the world it was permitted to hunt. He put the sea at his back, and the ice in front, and the thing at the boundary between them, and for the whole of that final night it did not cross. It could take 8 men out of a closed rope in a blindness. It could not, or would not, step past the line where the ice ended and the living sea began. Whatever it was, it belonged to the ice, and the ice had an edge, and at that edge, with the water lapping at his ruined feet, and the whole interior of a continent behind it emptied of the men he had marched in with. The thing that was not a man simply watched him and waited for the ice to take him instead, because the ice was where it was allowed to work. It hunted the living. It had no interest in the dead, and it could not follow the living past the place where its country stopped. He was found at that edge 2 days later. The relief party that came south along the barrier from the depot at the coast were not looking for survivors. They were looking for a body, or for nothing at all, because a team 4 days overdue on the Ross ice shelf in the last week of March, with winter closing the season like a shutter, was already written off in the private arithmetic of everyone who had ever wintered in the Antarctic. What they found was a single man sitting upright on the sea ice at the tide crack, his back to the water, his face to the interior, both feet frozen to the bone, snow-blind in one eye, and utterly, immovably silent. He would not stand. He would not turn around. When they reached to lift him, he fought them, and the only words the log of the relief party records him speaking, over and over until they sedated him with the medical brandy, were, "Don't put me back on the ice. Don't put me back on the ice." They carried him north, and here is where the story of the thing on the shelf stops being a story about a creature and becomes a story about how a country makes a thing disappear, not with a conspiracy, not with a sealed vault and armed men, but with paperwork and diagnosis, and the quiet decision that some testimony is simply not admissible into the record of the real. I have spent a long time inside what remains, and what remains is mostly the shape of what was removed. The expedition, I have not given you its official designation because you will not find it under that designation, and that is the point, appears in the Admiralty's Antarctic survey correspondence for 1933, and then does not appear. There is a requisition. There is a manifest of stores loaded at Littleton. There is a note of 8 names assigned to a shore party. And then there is a gap where the field report should be, and in the margin of the index, in a different hand and a different ink, the notation records not retained, not lost, not destroyed, not retained. The most bloodless phrase in the English language, and it has swallowed the deaths of 7 men. The survivor was not court-martialed, because to court-martial a man you must first believe he did something, and to believe he did something, you must first believe his account of what happened, and no one intended to believe his account. He was invalided home through New Zealand and then to England, and in the spring of 1935 he was admitted to a naval hospital, and from there to an institution in the West Country whose admission ledger lists his condition as delusional persecution, polar origin, chronic. He lived another 19 years inside it. And the single instruction that follows his name through the surviving fragments of his care record is the one that tells you everything about how frightened someone was of what he might say. He was not forbidden to speak. He was forbidden to name it. Any attempt by the patient to assign identity, species, or designation to the pursuing figure was to be discouraged and left unrecorded. They let him have the fear. They took away only the noun. Whatever followed him off the shelf was permitted to exist in his ruined mind as a shape, a presence, a thing, but never as a word that could be written down and read by someone else and believed. And the photograph. There was a photograph. The field diary refers to it plainly, plate exposed at the figure on the second evening, and a later expedition photographer's inventory, one of the few documents that survived because it was filed in the wrong series and nobody thought to pull it, lists a glass negative from that season with the annotation, Horizon Subject, Southbound Party. That plate exists. It is in a collection I will not send you rushing toward, because when you find it, as I did, you will find what I found. That the emulsion across the upper third of the frame, precisely where the horizon and any figure standing on it would fall, has been scored through with a blade, not fogged, not degraded. Scored, deliberate parallel scratches through the silver, the work of a hand and a tool, removing from the visible record the one thing a camera might have proven. Below the scoring, the ice is sharp and clear and 80 years old. Above it, someone made certain there would be nothing to argue with. So let me now do the thing I promised you I would do, and give the other side its full and honest weight, because it is strong, and I will not pretend it is not. A man marching for days at altitude on the polar plateau, dehydrated, starving, hypoxic in the thin, cold air, sleep-deprived past the point where the brain maintains the boundary between what is outside and what is within, that man will hallucinate. This is not speculation. It is documented repeatedly across the whole literature of polar and high-altitude travel. The sensed presence, the felt companion, the extra figure counted in a party that has one too few. Shackleton felt it, Messner felt it. Dozens of climbers on the death zone of the great peaks have described the silent third who walks beside 2 men. A figure on the horizon that never seems to move, that closes distance without motion, is a textbook Fata Morgana, a mirage of temperature inversion that lifts and stretches a distant object, a seal, a pressure ridge, a fuel drum, into a towering vertical shape that shudders and looms. And a man who has watched 7 companions die of cold and crevasse and exhaustion, and who alone survived, will do what the surviving mind does to make survival bearable. It invents a pursuer. Because a thing that hunted them is easier to live inside than the truth that they simply died, one by one, in the dark, of the cold, while he lived. The creature is the guilt, given legs. I find this persuasive. I want you to know that I find it genuinely, deeply persuasive, and that on most days it is what I believe. But it does not answer the tide line. A hallucination born of hypoxia does not stop at a change in the terrain, because the terrain is not what produces it. The brain is. A mirage does not decline to cross open water. A mirage cannot be aware there is open water to cross. A guilt pursuer, a phantom stitched together from grief and thin air, has no reason to halt at the exact geological seam where the shelf ice fractures into the sea, and every reason to follow its maker down onto the sea ice and out onto the black water and into death, because that is what guilt does. It does not respect boundaries. It has none. Yet the thing stopped. It stopped where the ice stopped. And a frostbitten man who could no longer feel his own feet, who was snowblind in one eye, who had marched himself past the last edge of the map and the last edge of his own reason, somehow knew with the certainty of an animal, that the one place it could not reach him was the far side of the tide crack, and he went there, and he was right. So I leave you where he was, on the sea ice, at the black margin, the whole emptied continent at his back and the ocean at his feet, in the last grey light of an Antarctic evening in March. And on the ice, at the boundary of its country, tall and white and jointed wrongly, the shape that mirrored 8 men and then took 7 of them, standing exactly where the solid world ended, patient, silent, unmoving, waiting, as it had waited for 4 nights, for the ice to finish the work it was not permitted to finish itself. He never named it. They made sure of that. And so the only honest question left is the one he took into 19 years of silence and then into the ground, the one the scratched plate will not answer, and the retained not records will not answer, and the felt presence of exhausted men on high cold mountains does not answer either. If it was only ever inside his mind, why did it know where the ice ended